Okay, good afternoon. I'll be brief. My name is Adam Johnson, and I'm here to introduce a great American writer, a dear friend and an old professor, Robert Olen Butler. A handsome old professor. Many of you may be deeply familiar with his work, but for people who are new, he's a writer who has been deeply engaged with the literary form for, many decades now. He's written a dozen novels, 6 short story collections. We know some of his accolades. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1993 for A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain, and he's been winning prizes ever since. The National Endowment for the Arts has recognized him, the Guggenheim, Foundation, the Faulkner Society, and of course, recently the Fitzgerald Prize. And his work has, I think, spoke deeply to the American experience. In fact, in the citation for his award from Columbia University at the Pulitzer Committee, they specifically noted the deep connection to the American experience through the voices of the Vietnamese for, completing a portrait in a certain and essential way. He's been a teacher and a mentor that's spoken to an entire generation of writers. He taught for a long time at McNeese State University in Calcasieu Parish, and now is the Epps Professor at Florida State University, and teaches the master classes in creative writing there. And I was his student once long ago. And I remember as a young student, I had a couple of like-minded friends, and we just fell in love with short stories. And we had a little club where we just before our classes as undergraduates, we would meet and have bagels in the morning at the little bagelery on campus, and we would read a short story out loud to each other. We just loved stories. I remember Guy Vanderhage, we read all those stories and devoured them. A.M. Holmes, and my friend Ben Sondheimer, who was from New Orleans here, came in with A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain. And just over the next couple weeks, we just took turns reading those stories every day. The penetrating way that Bob inhabited those voices, I will just never forget the way I traveled with those stories and with those characters as I went about my normal business, overlapping. And I knew right away that this was a writer I wanted to get closer to. I sent a story to Bob in Lake Charles, and I remember one Saturday morning I was totally hungover, and my phone rang, and I had wrapped a blanket around myself, and I remember the light, I remember the room, and Bob just talked to me for 45 minutes about everything wrong with my work. And it was a really special treat, but no one had given my work that seriousness, that attention, that examination, and I wonder if I didn't learn more in that one phone call than I had had in the last year of studying literature. And so I just went out and I read The Alleys of Eden, and I read The Deuce, and I deeply engaged that work, and I came to Lake Charles and was lucky enough to have him as a mentor, and I've been lucky enough to have him as a friend and an inspiration ever since. So here's Bob Butler.
Yeah, thank you, Adam, for those lovely words and fond memories. Adam has made the transition from my student to one of my very small number of literary heroes, so it's a pleasure. Speaking of heroes, Joe and Rosemary, thank you so much for all you've done for all of us. And from what I've seen of Megan at work, we're in good hands, so. Vietnam has been much on the minds of all of us since that Burns documentary. And I'm going to, because this is a conference about reading and writing, but also about performing, and Rosemary wants me to perform some for you, and I will read from my work toward the end. But I wanted to say a few things after that Burns documentary, which I'm sure most of you have seen, at least part of. It was a wonderful documentary about the aspects of the war that are most familiar to us. The combat. We walked through a great many battles in that documentary, and of course the protests and the divisions in families. But I think there were a couple of important aspects, perhaps in my mind almost perhaps the most important aspects of that war that got left out of the documentary, and I want to talk about those things first. Indeed, these things inform the book that I'm going to read to you from briefly at the end. But they are, they think they are absolutely central to Rosemary's theme of war and its collateral damage. There was collateral damage in a way that I would like to try to define for you. But first of all, I have to put you in a context. My Vietnam, the Army taught me how to speak Vietnamese. I went to intelligence school, became a counterintelligence special agent. This was all unwilling. I had a chance to understand that when I was going to be drafted before the lottery, I was able to enlist for a third year for the opportunity to choose my military occupational specialty. Counterintelligence special agent seemed a thing that would be insulated certainly from the killing, and even though I did not expect to end up in Vietnam, I expected to end up in a field office in San Diego doing background information interviews from people seeking top secret security clearances. That was how that was portrayed. Nevertheless, I went into the Army under that basis, went through basic training, went through counterintelligence school, then was sent to language school in Washington, D.C. I spent a year there, full-time, studying the language with a Vietnamese speaker. And it's a hard language because of its tonality. I had enough music background that I picked it up. Then in January of 1971, I went to Vietnam. My first day in Vietnam, I already spoke fluent Vietnamese. My second day in Vietnam, I fell madly, deeply in love with the Vietnamese people, their landscape, their history, their culture, their sensibility. And I spent 5 months working in intelligence out in the countryside. Had the opportunity to have close contacts with Vietnamese farmers and woodcutters and fishermen, provincial police chiefs. Then my unit stood down. It was 1971. I had ingratiated myself on a visit into Saigon with an American diplomat who was the advisor to the mayor of Saigon. And he instantly grabbed me up, had the Army assign me to him. I worked then for the last 7 months in Vietnam in a civilian closed job at Saigon City Hall as his administrative assistant and sometimes translator. I lived in an old French hotel. And every night for 7 months, almost literally every night, after midnight, I would leave my .38 pistol in the bottom drawer of my dresser. Armed only with the Vietnamese language, I would wander alone into the steamy back alleys of Saigon where nobody ever seemed to sleep. The Vietnamese are perhaps the most warm and generous-spirited people in the world, next to New Orleanians. And they inevitably invited me into their homes and into their culture and into their lives. I would remind you, by the way, there was some reason that this was inadvisable. This was a war without front lines, and one's mortality was always at stake. Indeed, to show you what a great intelligence officer I was an officer, I was actually an enlisted man, but intelligence operative. Condé Nast Traveler magazine sent me back to Saigon after the embargo was lifted to do a piece, and I wandered those back alleys and found an old noodle shop that I recognized, and went in, and there was a very old man in there who I recognized, and I had spent many a night in those back alleys just sitting with whatever odd assembly of men were in there, usually men, and we never talked about anything about the war, nothing about anything but the things that we understood as human beings, you know, our families and our romances and our animals and whatever. When I went back for Conde Nast Traveler, I learned that all those nights that I was there, that noodle shop was the central headquarters for the Viet Cong in Saigon. Intelligence was not my calling. But the human heart is. And as much as I learned about Vietnam and its people, that informed that level of authenticity that you must have, that Adam profoundly had in his Korean book. That level of authenticity about the Vietnamese, I got that way. I learned about Vietnam and those people and their hearts and their lives. Immersed myself, Vietnamized myself. But of my 23 books, 17 novels now and 6 books of short stories, only 7 of them actually draw on Vietnam clearly. But what I know about the human condition, about the human heart in every one of those books, I learned as much about all of that, every character I ever created, I learned about from the Vietnamese and from that common ground of humanity. My experience was not so odd, and this is one of the things that really got left out of the Burns documentary. This statistic is, I'm going to give you, it was very briefly cited, one throwaway line in the 10 episodes, and never was picked up. They rounded up. The number that I heard in Vietnam, and I think this is true of almost all armies and all wars. In Vietnam, only 18% of the men who went, and I'm saying men because we're talking the combat roles, 18% of the men who went to Vietnam saw battle in the way that you saw it in the Burns documentary, in the way that you think of Vietnam, carrying an M16 or flying a helicopter or whatever. 82% of the men who went to Vietnam never saw battle that way. I will remind you that they were very much aware of being in a war, but they never fought. For those people, and for everyone at home who watched this first televised war, for all of us, the Vietnam War was a different thing from the 18%. They faced the archetypal horrors of battle. But we all faced something else, just as profound. What we all experienced was the collision of cultures. American, Asian, fathers and sons, mothers and sons, mothers and daughters and men and their siblings and so forth. Those collisions of culture, and I mean those personal culture as well, that's what happened in Vietnam. The thing that we all, and I've heard it evoked in certain ways. Our friend last night, Martinez, or lunch yesterday, that the classic aspect of America that we have always believed in and never lived up to, but always believed in, and certainly believed in enough that it happened in some ways, the melting pot. That no matter what differences you brought to this place, that ultimately, in some level, we all melted together and that we became Americans. That pot was cracked forever, it seems to me, from the Vietnam War. And what that meant is this. And in talking about this, I want to bring it back because it is collateral damage in art, and that was the damage done. And the literary art, I have preached, and I'm going to talk tomorrow morning in my master class in more detail. But human beings and their feelings are at the center of literary fiction. But there's one other thing about literary fiction that is always there, and that is it's a temporal art form. It exists in time. You let the line length run on and you turn the page and you are, as they used to say, upon a time. And any Buddhist will tell you, this is one of the great truths of their religion, that as a human being with feelings, you cannot exist for 30 seconds of time on planet Earth without desiring something. The word I use with my students is yearning, because it suggests the deepest level of desire, which is where literary fiction goes. But what I'm saying is that fiction inevitably is the art form of human yearning. And indeed, if you think about it, the classic craft notion about story is plot. And what is plot? It's yearning, challenged, and thwarted. Now, since I taught Adam, I've actually, over the very last few years, come to what I think is a unified field theory of yearning. Walter's here somewhere. Einstein's, if I could borrow Einstein's phrase. If you dig deep enough into all great literary fiction, I think you're going to find that at its deepest level, fiction, the central character's yearning is I yearn for a self. I yearn for an identity. I yearn for a place in the universe. And all the closer to the surface, moment-to-moment goals and objectives and desires that characters have, down deep, that's the big thing. And it's the big thing in literature because I would suggest it's the big thing in life. This is what it's all about. Every morning, every soul on this planet wakes up, and whether you do it with a real mirror or a virtual mirror, whether you do it overtly or just unconsciously, we all look in the mirror and we go, who the hell are you? It's the great who the hell am I? And if you look at all of the other flashpoints in our society, in our politics, in our moment-to-moment life, race, gender, ethnicity, culture, politics, religion, sexual preference, what am I missing? You just name it. Take a half step back from all of that. And what are those things? Those are externally institutionalized or recognizable answers to that question. It's all about that. It is always all about that. Who am I? And when we went to Vietnam and we were all challenged in fresh and dynamic ways, what we do is we redrew the circle around us. Because all of those things I just mentioned, they represent drawing a circle, and so that you can identify who is your own and who is the other. It is the simplest, most direct way of feeling like you have found yourself. And God help us, as soon as you do that, yourself feels stronger and better, and you are more assured in it if you also believe that everybody in your circle is terrific and everyone outside it is insufficient or worse. That's what happened in Vietnam. That was perhaps the biggest bit of collateral damage. You see it today. Another challenge of self, which got left out of that Burns documentary, which came out of Vietnam. I mentioned to you especially wars, and all wars will always be like this now, where there's no front line. But an aspect of war and of going to war, and one of the reasons perhaps that wars still impulsively exist, is that the people who are in them, they may suffer the savages of combat, they may suffer the mortality, the jeopardy of life, but because of those very things, and what I'm about to say is true of the 82%, also true of the 18%, because of those very things, moment to moment, your sensual being is heightened. Your senses are stoked up. The joy of a pair of dry socks, or a good cup of coffee, or the touch of a woman, or the bonding of a few men together. Everything. The cast of light when you open your eyes in the morning, everything is intensely heightened in war. Not to mention, you live always with a cosmic consciousness that your imminent mortality, your sense of that you are a fragile, vulnerable critter here, that gives you a cosmic sense that is uniquely spurred by being in a war. Post-traumatic stress disorder. We understand it. The Burns documentary emblemized it, and rightly so, for the combat veteran who comes back with those secrets and that ravaged experience. And God knows their PTSD the combat soldiers is unique to that combat soldier and incredibly intense. But it's also true that there's this other PTSD, and the whole of the 82% came back with that. We came back traumatized because all those heightenings and all that consciousness of cosmos was in the war, and you went home. And that trauma is not the trauma of the horrors of the past. It is the trauma of the blandness of the present and the foreseeable future. That's a secret that men who go to war must surely keep from the people they love after the war. So that's what was missing from Burns. I don't have a pocket in here. Spoiled my gesture. All right. All those things, by the way, you're going to find, let me just introduce this to you. Perfume River, my most recent book, is the one I'm going to read to you from a little bit. It's not incidentally, it's also, as most of my books often are, a New Orleans novel. But it's also a Florida novel. And it is at its heart about the boomer generation, its families and its wars. But only one shot is fired in the present time in the book, and only 2 shots are fired in memory. The book's set in a couple of years ago, 2015. The novel is as well about secrets in families, not all of them having to do with war. I've mentioned a few of them so far. And the novel is about how the past is always with us, always in deep dialogue with the present. There are 3 central couples. One of them is Robert and Darla Quinlan, both boomers, both university professors in northern Florida. Yeah, Florida State. And yeah, his name is Robert. Look, Graham Greene once said, all good novelists have bad... You know, he didn't say this. I've been saying this for years, and I do it in about 38 words. I finally looked it up. He says it in 247 words. I should probably stop citing him. But the point is this. All good novelists have bad memories. What you remember comes out as journalism. What you forget goes into the compost of the imagination. And so to the extent that this Robert is me and that university is that, to the extent that it's literal or autobiographical, to that extent my art fails. So this is not a nudge in the ribs. There's another character in the book who calls himself Bob, and he's a homeless man. And Robert, actually, the passage you're about to read, he's in there too. I just needed a wonderful name from that era, and it has a long form and a diminutive form. And there's already a Jimmy in the book and already a William, so I couldn't, that was the right one. That's it. So, in this passage that I'm going to read you, Robert and Darla Quinlan are about to sleep. Earlier this evening, they went to dinner at a local organic food co-op. There, Robert fed a homeless man who calls himself Bob. At first, mistakenly, Robert took Bob to be a fellow Vietnam vet. But he was wrong about that. And he realizes that before that scene is over. Now, in this bit I'm reading to you, as Robert and Darla go through their end of evening ritual, he is about to encounter a crucial memory, the font of two of his kept secrets, and they will expand in him through the novel. In bed now, Darla inserts her iPod earbuds, and she and Robert switch off their lamps. Their Kindles have their own light. The tinny spill of Bach from his wife's ears fades quickly from Robert's awareness. Soon, however, he is reading the same few sentences over and over. He turns off his book. "Good night," she says, aware of the vanishing of his light in her periphery. "Good night," he says, though they have long ago agreed that the formality of his reply is unnecessary, since her head at this point is always full of music and she cannot hear him. Nor do they kiss. They are so very familiar with each other. And that familiarity has become the presiding expression of their intimacy. Robert sleeps, and he wakes. He's been dreaming, but he does not remember a single image of the dream. Not that he tries. It is enough that he is awake. The room is dark. He turns his face toward Darla. He can make out, more kinesthetically than visually, the topography of her. She's lying on her side, facing away. He gently pulls back the covers, ekes his way from the bed so as not to disturb her, puts on slippers and robe, and he goes out of the room and along the hallway and down the stairs. He pulls his topcoat as well from the vestibule closet, enters the wide dark of the living room, and passes through the French doors and onto the rear veranda. He stands at its edge. The moonless sky is clear and the stars are bright. His bare ankles are cold, but his chest is warm. He once would have snuck a smoke here. He didn't need Darla to persuade him to abandon cigarettes, even an isolated open-air smoke or two. His father's burr grinder cough did that. Now he simply puffs his breath into the starlight. His live oak stands before him in vast silhouette, its lower horizontal branches thick as most trees, thick as water oaks and pin oaks. On other nights, with or without cigarettes, he felt that his scholarly specialty, his life's work, his very mind were made manifest in this tree. After all, it stood there through early 20th century America, breathing oxygen into that era's air. It even likely witnessed the birth and death of the Confederacy, perhaps even Andrew Jackson's war on the Seminoles, Old Hickory's ruthlessness thwarted by the tribe's guerrilla elusiveness. But on this night, as Robert folds his arms across his chest and squares himself to the oak, he feels the presence not of the ghosts of history, but of Bob. Bob, the illusory Vietnam veteran. He evoked Vietnam over Robert's quinoa at the health food store, and then, being illusory in that regard, couldn't vent the war away. So it has settled back into Robert himself. For this, the veranda facing the oak tree is the wrong place to be tonight. A tree sits in the center of Robert's Vietnam. He unfolds his arms, thinks to turn, to retreat to bed, but he does not move. Instead, he wakes, and it's dark, and a woman is beside him, naked and small. And she is waking too, and the room is still heavy with the incense she has burnt for her dead. Robert has lingered with her, fallen asleep with her in a back street of the south bank of the Perfume River in the city of Hue. It is 3:40 in the morning. January 31st, 1968, and they have woken to the sound of the North Vietnamese rockets and mortar rounds coming in from the mountains to the west. Robert blinks hard against the memory. He will not let certain things in. He pats his pockets now by reflex, as if he will find a cigarette, and he turns his face a little, breaking with his live oak. But the woman lingers, still naked, in the dark of the room, lit through the window by a distant flare from across the rooftops. And now he's throwing on his clothes. Hue was supposed to be different, traditionally spared by both sides. The targets of the North's New Year's offensive were thought surely to have been revealed in the fighting that commenced this time yesterday. Surely it was all coordinated. He's dressed, and he and the woman are standing beside the bed. Her name is Lian. Lotus. She hands him something. Metal. He knows the thing. It is a French .32 caliber pistol that belonged to her father. Do Robert and the woman speak? Of course they do. He loves her, but he will not remember more of her now. And he is down the back stairs and into the dead fish stench of the alley, and the AK-47s are popping from across the river. The Viet Cong, or maybe even the North Vietnamese regulars, though his job has been to count men, weapons from all the field intelligence that comes in. He thinks we don't know jack shit about them for all our counting. He goes out into the street, and far down in the street lamps along the river, he sees the men moving, the men he counts. He thinks, I am a dead man. He turns and runs in the direction of MacV, the U.S. compound, half a dozen blocks away. He rushes past storefronts and the passageways into rear courtyards, and past the smells of mildew and dead fish and the smell of wood fires. And from all directions now comes the din of weaponry, of small arms and RPDs, and the whoosh and suck and blare of rockets, the sky flaring across the river beyond the Imperial Palace walls. They're hitting Taylock, the city airport to the north. And now he sees men before him as well. A squad of dark-clothed men a block up the river, and a gunfire is cracking everywhere. And now a needle-thin compression of air zips past his head, and he lunges into an alley mouth, and he's running hard. And figures are coming to doorways, and he thinks the local communist cadres are emerging. He thinks again that he is dead. And there is only darkness around him, and the alley slime underfoot, and he pushes hard. And if he is to die, he'd rather not see it happening, so he doesn't look right or left or feel any of the bodies coming out. He just runs, and he is out of the alley, and he is in a pocket park and standing before a great dark form. A banyan tree. It is old and it is vast. Its aerial roots are thick as young trees and nuzzled together into their own dense forest, propping up a billowing dark sky of leaves. And there is a deep inner curve to the roots and a turning. And in the direction of the MacV compound, there's heavy small arms fire now. And he hears the AK-47s, and he hears an answering M60 machine gun and the M16s. And he knows what to do. He enters the tree. He moves into the turning, and he puts his back to its roots, and he sits, and he draws his legs into him, and he is in the dark. He can see around the outcurving columns of roots. Bodies appear nearly as dark as the night, moving quickly past with a metallic rustle of weapons. And he pulls his head back, squeezes into himself. He closes his eyes and smells a dank, wet earth smell and something fainter beneath, an almost sweetness and a little sharp thing in the nose. And he thinks of the girl's incense and the dead she prays for. He knows this tree has killed another to live. These roots around him, holding him in the dark, began long ago by wrapping themselves around another tree, the strangler roots, embracing a living tree until it vanished, until it was dead inside the growing banyan. Rifles flare nearby, and he presses back into the killing embrace of the banyan. He holds the French pistol in his right hand, flat against his chest. He expects to die here. Robert steps from his veranda. He's panting heavily. He has not let this happen for several years. He moves across his lawn now, approaches his tree. He places both hands upon its trunk hard to stop their trembling. He leans heavily there, waiting for this to pass. But still he thinks, I was not meant to be here. I was not meant to live this life I've led. I was meant to die long ago. Long, long ago.